So many look at a gifted kid and they think, oh, well, why aren't you getting straight A's? And they miss the piece about a child who could have a learning difference, or a child who can, potentially not be engaged because they may already know the material.
Welcome to Tilt Parenting, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. I'm your host, Debbie Reber. This week, I'm bringing back to the podcast neuroscientist, author, and speaker, Dr. Nicole Tetreault. As you'll hear in our conversation, Nicole was propelled to study neuroscience after her mother's diagnosis with Parkinson's disease. She then went on her own journey of self-discovery while supporting her twice exceptional son and recognizing many traits in herself. All this culminated in her new book, Insight into a Bright Mind, a neuroscientist's personal stories of unique thinking, which melds groundbreaking research with the captured experiences of unique, creative, and intense brains. And can I just say, I really loved Nicole's new book. I'm excited to give you an inside look at it, as it's truly a unique and important addition to what currently exists to help parents better understand their exceptional kids' needs, and perhaps to better understand themselves as well. Nicole brings an incredible breadth of knowledge and personal experience to the neurodiversity movement, as well as a deep passion for science communication. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Before I get to that, I want to give a quick shout out to Jessica Shannon and Holly Stern, two new supporters of this show. Thank you so much. Supporters like you make it possible for me to keep bringing these conversations to listeners everywhere by helping me cover the costs associated with producing this podcast. If you're a regular listener and you get a lot out of the show and would like to support it, I invite you to join my Patreon campaign. Through Patreon, you can make a small monthly contribution as little as $2 a month to help cover the cost of production. To learn more, visit patreon.com/tiltparenting. And now, here's my conversation with Nicole. Hello, Nicole. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I just was thinking of the last time you were on. It was probably about a year ago, and we were kind of newer or just adapting to the realities of COVID and talking about what our kids were and us as parents were going through. So hard to believe that was a whole year ago, but I'm so excited to be bringing you back to talk about your incredible book. And before we get into that, can you just take a few minutes, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your story, and maybe how you came to write the book that we're going to be talking about today?
Okay, yeah. So how I came about the book really was kind of a journey to kind of take a deep dive into what we have entrenched in our society about intelligence and giftedness and neurodiversity, and to kind of really provide the latest scientific information for parents and educators to really understand the complexities that goes on in neurodiverse kids. My son was identified as gifted in third grade, and it really reshaped my entire life of how I parented him, because what I had to really do was step outside of myself and see him and nurture him as his divine essence, and kind of bringing who he is to light. And in that, I know that often neurodiverse kids struggle with the ways that they don't fit in to society's standard box. They're very unique and unconventional. And I really wanted to give the scientific background of what's happening in the brain and the body of individuals, so really we can have a more compassionate dialogue and greater acceptance for neurodiverse kids and adults. Often it's not too far that when parents figure out they have a neurodiverse kid, they say, oh my goodness, I've been dealing with all these different things my entire life. And another big piece for me was reading all the different work that was out there, starting with James T. Webb and Susan Daniels and your book, and the things that you kind of discover along the way that, oh, I'm neurodiverse too. And I've been kind of, hiding pieces, and being in this sort of shadow form. And so it was sort of an awakening for me to stand and say, hey, I'm dyslexic. I've had a different wired brain my entire life, like your book. And it really was sort of a way that I felt like I could actually talk about it on a couple different levels.
Would you mind sharing a little bit about your own journey with dyslexia? Because, your voice, this is such a unique book, first of all, in the way that it is so personal, and it is the neuroscience, but in such an accessible way. It, to me, was such an unusual and unique approach to a topic that could be really cerebral or really heady. And instead, it felt so inviting and accessible. So part of that was you as the narrator, you as the storyteller. So could you just tell us a little bit more about your own discovery of your neurodivergence?
Yeah. So how I came into my own neurodiversity, and I want a lot of listeners to listen to this piece, because perhaps you have a number of aspiring writers. And in writing this, it was an experiment. I definitely did things deliberately where I kind of converged a lot of different forms with kind of the inspiration between Lydia Yuknovich, her writing in the sense that, kind of breaking certain types of form and inviting the reader in a different way. And it was an experiment. And in that, I had my very first editor who said to me, this just isn't going to work. You're trying too many different things. What's your audience? What are you doing? And I had to really let go of that editor and find a new one. And when I found my new editor, it so happened that she has synesthesia herself, but she happens to be very good with words and grammar and things like that. And I had, a neurodiverse editor, and she really said, we can get this to work, and saw the experiment on the page and playing with the different forms. And so that's just a side note about writing that I wanted to really share with your readers, that, sometimes when you're taking a risk, things may not work out, things may work out. And as you talk about, the piece where I really wanted to make neuroscience accessible, having in this journey, I read over 2,000 papers trying to really figure things out. And in that, my passion to really communicate science and not totally make it, so simplified that it was meaningless, that I kind of wanted the reader along the way to look upwards if they didn't understand something. And if I didn't, if there was something I explained and they were really interested even further to take that topic into their own domain to investigate, I really wanted to bring light also what the latest neuroscience was, and that really comes from the fact of when I became a neuroscientist, my mother had Parkinson's disease. And a lot of what I saw was going on in the laboratory wasn't translated to the patients and the population that needed it mostly. And there was always this kind of 7 to 8 year lag between the two. And so for me, I really, really wanted to communicate the science in an effective way where people were empowered and they have the latest data where they can make informed decisions about themselves and their children, and coming from a place of knowledge for their family. So that's really where that came from.
So fascinating. Yeah. Again, It totally works. And I love hearing the little side note story of finding that editor who really got it. And that is such an important part. As a writer, I know how critical that is. And it really works. And so let's talk more about brain wiring. Why do you feel it's so important that people understand what's really happening with neurodivergent, with twice exceptional, with these fascinating, differently wired humans?
Well, I feel like it's the basis, right? I think that, part of how we've come into this world is we have these neuro-unique imprints. We have this neuro-individuality. And I think what happened when we think about the educational system early on was this kind of mass production of having kids sit in the classroom with their hands crossed, and doing the work and listening. And when you think about it, children's brains and adults' brains were not meant to sit for extended periods of time, taking in information and also producing, especially if information isn't engaging. And so the reason why the wiring and the different types of wiring are so important is that brains respond to information based on the way it's presented in two main ways: an emotional connection and a level of engagement. So if you're teaching a child something and an adult, if you're teaching somebody something that they already know, their brain is going to be naturally less engaged, first of all. Second of all, if the information is not meeting the level of engagement, either if it's too high or too low, you're going to get low motivation. So the point we look at, different types of brain wiring and different types of the way the brain really responds has to do with creating a high level maximal engagement. So for example, we know, kids that are gifted, that if they are being taught rote information and it's not meeting their level, they're not going to be motivated in class. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you give them work that's meeting their level, then they are going to thrive. The other thing that I really think we do a major disservice to is our children who are on the autism spectrum. There's so many different mistakes that we make in the fact that children on the spectrum and adults have very different communication and production styles. And when we don't take that into account in life, not just in the educational system, we can really miss their natural gifts, talents, and abilities because they really communicate differently than us. And so we have to kind of step outside of ourselves and really inquire what's going on in that neuro uniqueness. How is that individual able to convey and share information? And how can we help them kind of nurture their natural strengths and show us what their gifts are? And so that's why the brain wiring really matters when we think about it. And even when you think about children who, are diagnosed with ADHD, they tend to be highly creative. They can manage a lot of information at once. And so when we kind of can look at the positives and the strengths in each of these different types of neurotypes, we're able to better guide them to naturally share their gifts and their real strengths. And a lot of these different brain wirings as well tend to be really beneficial for society. And they're necessary, and as you point out in your book and I do as well, it's 1 in 5 individuals. So, we kind of need to really open up and help these individuals really share their unique ways of thinking, because they can be the ones who lead us in the new direction for, solutions in our society.
We'll be right back after this quick break. During this month of planning and organization for big transitions, rhythms and routines have been absolutely essential for our physical and emotional well-being. So Green Chef nights are reliably and predictably a good night. We know the ingredients will be fresh and prepped, the instructions easy to follow, and the meal delicious. We're all still talking about last week's turkey tacos with mango chimichurri sauce, refried beans, and Monterey Jack cheese. Green Chef contributes to a healthy lifestyle with easy and delicious menus like fresh seasonal salads and grain bowls. And with over 80 weekly meal and market options, plus rotating options to suit a variety of lifestyles, whether Mediterranean, plant-based, calorie-smart, keto, protein-packed, gluten-free, there are always plenty of options to choose from. Whatever you select, you'll get farm-fresh ingredients, organic whole fruits and veggies, and premium proteins, all delivered straight to your door. I love those 4 words. Straight to my door. Oh, and one more thing I love about Green Chef, they have an app, which means it's easy to manage meal preferences and delivery from your phone if you want to. And I, for one, want to. I am in that mode where I'm making the most of little moments like waiting in line at the pharmacy or for the F train to pull into the station to tackle all of those to-dos. So the convenience of an app is key for me. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Synbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Synbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon, and that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Synbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Synbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Synbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. Well, what do you think is getting in the way, from these kids being able to support their gifts? What are kind of the misunderstandings or the misinterpretations? How is society and educational systems really getting it wrong when it comes to neurodivergent kids, and especially 2E kids?
Well, I think there are a lot of complexities. I think first and foremost, I think educational systems are inundated with meeting test standards. And so academic performance is really the greatest measure for the success of teachers rather than actual child's and the whole class's engagement. I think we also really struggle with the fact that when we're looking at these sort of standardized tests that we're putting pressure on for our kids, is that when we know the brain and individuals develop asynchronously, meaning that their brain doesn't develop all at the same time, they may be quite ahead, years ahead in reading, but may take delayed time for written production, is that we can be totally missing their abilities because the tools, the blunt instruments that we're using don't measure their actual abilities. And then I think the third thing is that sheer education. I think our educators get credentials, and I think they are talented individuals out there working. And at the same time, they're not equipped with the skills or the tools to deal with 1 in 5 kids being neurodivergent. And I think that when you have 30 kids in a classroom, that can be very overwhelming to an educator, and they may not know how to handle that. And more often than not, these kids tend to miss marks. They tend to think outside the box, but thinking outside the box means that they could also have behaviors that are outside of the box, where they're not kind of seen as society as acceptable behaviors. And a lot of these kids get really deemed with being disruptors or low motivation or bad behaviors, when it has to do with the fact that there's a misalignment in their learning and engagement, and there's a misalignment in really understanding how to motivate their unique mind, because they're so centered on academic performance and achievement. And so there are kind of layers of issues that we're dealing with. And so that's why, and I think the other thing too, is that in society in general, when we talk about neurodiverse kids, and we're talking about gifted, so many look at a gifted kid and they think, oh, well, why aren't you getting straight A's? And they miss the piece about a child who could have a learning difference, or a child who can, potentially not be engaged because they may already know the material. And so I think as a society, what's happening is we're developing these schools that are secondary schools that focus on, kids that are neurodivergent. But I think in our standard school system, there's really a miss within the system itself.
I'm wondering if you see opportunities here. As we're recording this, it's May 2021. We have this idea that in the fall, most kids will be returning to some sort of quote unquote normalcy in schools. And there are a lot of conversations happening about, that we don't want to go back to the way things were, and what can we take with us that we've learned about how kids think and process, and how can we change things moving forward? So do you see opportunities in the traditional education model as we, re-enter school life?
Yeah, I do see that what educators and parents and kids really dealt with this year was a lot of adaptability and flexibility. And I think that the fact that kids went from in person, where they really lost that social emotional connection, and have been on Zoom and had alternative learning styles, I think there's been kind of a window of opportunity for children and educators to see how each child kind of learns differently, and how certain things of the pandemic may have worked better and how certain things may have been more challenging. And I think that there is a great growth opportunity for educators to kind of create a more inclusive environment, especially when it comes with, the way children produce information, the way a child learns, understanding if you have a child who tends to be very into the mode of learning naturalistically, how are you going to, bring that into the classroom in their math? And how's there going to be kind of this more holistic approach to education rather than this kind of rote machine that I think what has been practiced in the past years?
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting indeed. And I'm feeling cautiously optimistic that we're going to see some changes based on the learnings of the past year in more traditional settings. But I'm not going to ask you to solve the educational crisis and figure and come up with the perfect blueprint for how schools can really meet these kids' needs. But, what have you learned are some of the best practices when it comes to, even just us as parents and caregivers supporting neurodivergent learners?
Yeah, I mean, I think the model of Dr. Susan Baum is really probably the primary mode that she at Bridges Academy and Bridges Graduate School of Education for Cognitive Diversity really centers on the strength-based model, that when you find where a child has natural strengths, you support it and you guide that child through their learning based on their strengths. And when you do that, there becomes this more holistic approach where areas that they may be more challenged, they learn how to have these natural abilities develop concurrently. I think the second piece is bringing in supports when a child needs it. You know, if you have a child who really kind of struggles with executive functioning and turning things in, you know, creating systems where they don't have to deal with turning in assignments. You know, my son was the type of kid in middle school where he would get all his work done, the kid who didn't write his name on his papers, and the teachers knew his writing, right? Because he had very unique writing. And the deal is turning in his homework was such a challenge that we came to the conclusion that there's one folder, you know, when he was in 6th grade, where the first period teacher handed it off to the second period teacher and so on and so forth. And by the end of the year, he had one homework folder that he gained the skill to transfer it himself. And so sometimes, you know, kids just take a little bit longer time to learn these sort of executive functioning skills. And I think it's really important that they're not shamed or having points taken off or demonized for having really different types of modes, because he was a type of kid who was so excited, would go straight to the work, and it didn't matter if his name was on the paper. And so when it comes back to it, when you give the child the room to really explore their natural talents and their strengths, and you build from that, learning becomes automatically engaging. Learning becomes highly motivated, where they're getting high levels of dopamine, where it's rewarding and they're in flow. And then on top of it, if they have areas where they need support, bring them in.
Yeah, that's great. We'll be right back after this quick break. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything, because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
Lynn, this time of year, parenting can be such a flusterclux.
You've come to the right place. I'm Lynn Lyons, and I've been treating anxious families for over 30 years.
I'm Lynn's sister-in-law and co-host Robin Hudson.
Join us for Flusterclux, a podcast for parents who worry.
Wait, that's everybody.
Yeah, these last few years have felt like one long anxiety attack for so many.
Why do you think parents are always surprised that a podcast about anxiety relates to them, even if no one in their house has an anxiety disorder?
Well, worry is human. Everyone does it. And anxiety shows up when we face uncertainty. me.
All the parenting tips you've taught me have been essential.
I love to break it down into skills we need to manage worry in our families.
We've covered so many topics: depression, burnout, meltdowns, perfectionism.
Don't forget scary mothers-in-law.
Right, but of course that's not my mother-in-law.
Because that's my mother.
And a listener.
As a psychotherapist, I like to teach parents and kids how to respond to everyday moments in healthy ways.
Managing anxiety really can be taught.
It really can. And I'll even tell you what to say.
We talk about serious stuff, but without being too serious.
Anxiety wants everything serious. Anxiety doesn't stand a chance when we're laughing, even about the tough stuff.
So your book is, I think it's required reading for parents raising twice exceptional or neurodivergent kids. But I can also just see so many parents coming to this book thinking they want to read about how to support their child and really recognizing themselves, their own 2E-ness, if you will. So I'm wondering what thoughts you have for parents reading the book who self-identify as part of their incorporating your words. Is there an onboarding process for parents who kind of come to these conclusions about themselves as adults?
Yeah, I think that's often the case. I think, with previous books in the past that have really delved into this area, that's always the case, that you're in search to support your child. And along the way, you realize, oh, genetically, they're half me. Mm-hmm. And, coming into that, I think really stepping back and redoing your own blueprint, that was what happened for me at the time when I finished my PhD. I was kind of lined up with a standard postdoc job, and it was a really exciting opportunity. And I had to decide in that moment to really transition my career and decide to become a science communicator. And in that, it took a lot of time and a whole new layers of skills and muscles to learn. But in that, concurrently, I was finding my son was twice exceptional and I was twice exceptional. And, a lot of compassion, I think really that softening awareness of coming to the moment, like, this is it. This is part of who I am, and this is okay. And this belongs, I think there had been so many stories, from our educational times where I'll speak for myself, stuffed myself down because I didn't fit in that box. And I thought, this is what it's like to be an adult. This is what it's like to be a scientist. And it's like, no, be me. And whatever those parts come out. And so I think in the exploration of this book, really, I think the parents coming to honoring their own personal story. And I'm working on a workbook to go with it right now because I've had so many people with questions and kind of want that guidance. And so part of that is sort of exploratory journalistic writing to kind of identify your own story along the way.
Yeah. Reading it, that's what it felt like to me, as I said in the beginning, not just accessible, but you use the word compassion. And it really, that sense of compassion, of self-compassion, and just a lot of grace and understanding for our own personal journeys really comes through. And so it's just it was so different in so many ways because it isn't prescriptive. It's informative, and it's almost like a big welcome to the club book, And as I was reading it, I was lucky enough to get an advance copy, as you know, thank you very much. And there were so many people I instantly thought of that I wanted to send this book to, because I think it would be very comforting to have that as a companion in their own journeys as adults. So, listeners, the book is called Insight into a Bright Mind, a Neuroscientist's Personal Stories of Unique Thinking. It's a very unique book. And is there anything that we haven't covered about the book that you would really want listeners to know about today?
No, I think we covered a lot of material. And I just think what you've been doing for the community for the past, 7-8 years, really supporting them has been an inspiration to me and has guided my way through it. And I think, with your podcast and with Differently Wired, your book, there is so much of that compassion and the advocacy piece of, let's work on this together. We may not solve everything at once, but we'll do it step by step. And I think, I just have so much gratitude to, spend this time with you and connect with you on our shared interest and passions in this.
Thank you so much. And, listeners, you should just know that this is our third device, our third app. So if you hear different sound qualities throughout this interview, it's because we kept getting booted off of different systems. So Nicole has been very patient with my tech issues today. But please take a moment and let listeners know where they can connect with you and learn more about your work.
Yeah, they can visit my website, NicoleTetreault.com. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Awesome Neuro. And a lot of my writings are on my website. And my book is everywhere books are sold. So, I'd love to hear from you, reach out. And, Debbie, I'd have to say persistence, is the through line of this podcast. And it kind of just shows what you have to do to be a parent of a neurodivergent kid is persistent.
Yes, it was a very themed experience today, for sure. That's great. Well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the words that you said at the end about tilt parenting. And I actually wrote about this in my newsletter last week, as I have been interviewing folks for the summer season of this podcast. I've talked with Jonathan Mooney, who is an incredible advocate, and just so many fantastic people. And it is really exciting when you think about everyone out there, right, who's doing work and approaching this paradigm shift from different perspectives. And we're all in this together. It gets me really excited. So thank you so much for your part in this movement and for sharing all of this with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. For the show notes for this episode, visit tiltparenting.com/podcast and search for this conversation. If you like what you heard on today's episode, I would be grateful if you could take a minute to head over to Apple Podcasts and leave a rating or a review. Thank you so much for helping us stay visible so people who would benefit from the show can easily find it. If you want to support the show and help me cover the cost of production, please consider joining my Patreon campaign. To support the show, just visit patreon.com/tiltparenting. Lastly, if you aren't already part of the online community at Tilt, I invite you to sign up at tiltparenting.com on the box in the bottom where it says Join the Revolution. Every Thursday, I send out a short email with a quick note from me, a link to that week's podcast episode, and links to 5 stories from the news that week that are relevant to parents like us. Again, you can sign up and learn more about Tilt at www.tiltparenting.com.
If you're a parent, I invite you to join us at the Mindful Mama podcast, where it's all about becoming a less irritable, more joyful parent. With sometimes hilarious and always thought-provoking experts and friends, at Mindful Mama, we know that you cannot give what you do not have. And when you have calm and peace within, then you can give it to your children. I'm Hunter Clark Fields, and I can't wait to see you there. Listen in to the Mindful Mama podcast.